The morning sun filtered through the silk curtains of the penthouse, casting a golden glow on Edward Worthington's sleeping face. His eyes slowly opened, staring at the ornate ceiling above. For a moment, he remained still, feeling the invisible weight of expectations and responsibilities that came with his name and fortune. Edward sighed deeply, running a hand through his perfectly trimmed hair. At 35, he had everything money could buy, but he felt a void that no bank account could fill. He got out of bed, his feet sinking into the soft carpet as he walked to the panoramic window. New York City stretched below, a maze of skyscrapers and bustling streets. Edward watched the people below, small as ants, rushing to start another day. How many of them were truly happy? How many had genuine relationships, not tainted by greed or interest? The sound of high heels clicking on the marble floor announced the arrival of Veronica Sinclair, his girlfriend of 2 years. She entered the room like a gust of scented wind, all smiles and energy. "Eddie, darling, you won't believe what I just saw in Tiffany's catalog," Veronica exclaimed, her eyes sparkling with the promise of yet another expensive gift. Edward turned slowly, observing the stunning woman in front of him. Veronica was the epitome of glamour, with her perfectly styled blonde hair and a dress that cost more than many people's annual salaries. "Veronica," he began, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk." Her smile faltered for a moment, but quickly returned, although a bit forced. "Sure, love. About what?" Edward took a deep breath, preparing for the words he knew would change everything. "This isn't working. We aren't working." The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica stared at him, her blue eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "We are perfect together, Eddie. Everyone says so. Perfect for the cameras. Maybe," Edward replied, feeling a wave of sadness and relief at the same time. "But when was the last time we had a real conversation? When did we connect beyond the parties, jewelry, and luxury cars?" Veronica stepped back, as if she had been slapped. "Are you breaking up with me? Over this?" "Eddie, be reasonable. We have everything." "No, Veronica. We have things," Edward said gently, "but we don't have anything that really matters." Tears began to form in Veronica's eyes, but Edward couldn't determine if they were from genuine sadness or frustration at losing her access to the luxurious lifestyle. "You'll regret this, Edward Worthington," she hissed, all pretense of affection gone. "Good luck finding someone who understands you like I do." With that, she spun on her heels and left, the door slamming behind her with a final thud. Edward closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision he had just made. When he opened them again, his gaze fell on a framed photo on the bedside table. Him and his parents, years ago, smiling in front of a modest suburban house. It was before the fortune, before the expectations, before everything changed. At that moment, an idea began to form in his mind. A crazy, risky, but potentially transformative idea. If he wanted to find something real, something genuine, maybe he needed to leave all this behind, even if temporarily. Edward picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before dialing a number. "Hello, Jack? It's Edward. I need a favor, and it's a bit unconventional." As he explained his plan to his trusted assistant, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that, maybe, beyond the gilded walls of his cage of luxury, he could find something true, something real. The sun continued to rise over the city, marking the beginning not just of a new day, but of a journey that would change Edward Worthington's life forever. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee and burnt toast lingered in the air of the Maple Street diner. Olivia Miller tied the worn apron around her waist, her fingers skillfully making a perfect bow in the back. She took a deep breath, soaking in the comforting familiarity of the place that had been her second home for almost 5 years. "Olivia, table 3 has been waiting for 10 minutes. Mr. Henderson's gruff voice, the diner manager, cut through the air like a sharp knife. "I'm coming, Mr. Henderson," Olivia replied, forcing a smile as she grabbed the coffee pot. Her brown eyes, tired but determined, scanned the crowded room. The diner was a mosaic of lives. Hurried executives sipping espresso, elderly patrons reading yellowed newspapers, and students poring over textbooks. Olivia navigated between the tables with the grace of a ballerina, balancing plates and filling cups with efficiency born of practice. "Good morning, Mr. Johnson," she greeted a gray-haired gentleman at table 3. "Sorry for the wait. The usual for you?" The man smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. You know how I like it, dear. And don't worry about the wait. Your smile makes up for everything. Olivia felt a warmth in her chest. It was for moments like this that she loved her job, despite the hardships. Every customer was a story, every interaction an opportunity to bring a little light to someone's day. As she moved to the next table, Olivia noticed a man sitting alone in the corner, dressed in shabby clothes and looking anxiously out the window. She approached, her heart tightening at the lost expression on his face. "Hi, can I get you something?" she asked gently. The man looked at her, his blue eyes shining with an intensity that caught her by surprise. For a moment, Olivia felt as though she was looking at something deeper, something hidden behind that worn-out facade. "I just wanted to warm up a bit," he murmured, looking away. Olivia hesitated for a second before making a decision. "How about a cup of coffee? On the house." The man stared at her, surprised. "You would do that?" "Sure," Olivia smiled, already pouring a cup. Everyone deserves a little kindness, don't they? As she placed the steaming cup in front of him, the doorbell rang, announcing more customers. Olivia turned to greet them, missing the look of admiration and gratitude the man cast in her direction. The rest of the shift passed in a blur of orders, bills, and fragmented conversations. Olivia moved tirelessly, her smile never wavering, even when her feet ached and her back begged for rest. Near the end of her shift, she noticed that the man in the corner had left, leaving behind the empty cup and a folded napkin. Curious, Olivia opened it, finding 2 words written in surprisingly elegant handwriting. "Thank you." A genuine smile lightened her tired face. It was for moments like this that she continued, despite the difficulties. "Miller." Mr. Henderson's voice yanked her out of her thoughts. "My office." "Now." Olivia's smile faltered, but she straightened her shoulders and followed the manager to the back of the diner. The small office smelled of stale cigarette smoke and cheap disinfectant. "Olivia," Henderson began, his voice a mix of exasperation and resignation. "You know we can't keep giving away food for free. It comes out of our pocket." Olivia bit her lip, fighting the urge to argue. "I know, Mr. Henderson, but sometimes a bit of kindness can make all the difference for someone." The manager sighed, rubbing his tired face. "Your heart is bigger than your good sense, girl. One more of these, and it comes out of your paycheck, understood?" Olivia nodded, swallowing the frustration. As she left the office, her eyes fell on a faded poster on the wall. "Dream big." She smiled sadly, reminded of her own dream of someday opening a bakery. Returning to the dining area, Olivia grabbed a cloth and began cleaning the empty tables. Through the window, she watched the city waking up to the night, building lights flickering like earthly stars. One day, she murmured to herself, "One day, I'll have my own place. A place where no one will be turned away hungry." The doorbell rang again, and Olivia turned, her welcoming smile already in place. After all, every new customer was a new story, a new chance to make a difference. And for Olivia Miller, that was the true wealth of life. The sun had barely risen when Edward, now unrecognizable in his disguise as Dave, walked through the doors of the Maple Street diner. The smell of coffee and frying bacon enveloped him, so different from the gourmet cafes he was used to. He chose a corner booth, the same one from the previous day, and watched the diner's hustle with attentive eyes. It didn't take long for Olivia to appear, her brown hair tied in a messy bun and faint circles under her eyes. Yet her smile was radiant as she approached Dave. "Good morning. It's nice to see you again," she said, her voice filled with genuine joy that caught Edward by surprise. "What will it be today? Another coffee?" Edward hesitated, suddenly feeling nervous. "Actually, I don't have money today." Olivia's smile faltered for a moment, but soon it returned, even warmer. "Don't worry about that. How about some porridge? I just made a fresh batch." Before Edward could protest, she had already walked towards the kitchen. He watched her go, a strange feeling forming in his chest. Was it gratitude? Admiration? Something else? Minutes later, Olivia returned with a steaming bowl of porridge and a cup of coffee. "Here you are. And don't worry, it's on me." "Why are you doing this?" Edward asked, genuinely curious. Olivia shrugged, a gentle smile on her lips. "Because everyone deserves a little kindness, no matter who they are or where they come from." With those words, she walked away to attend to other customers, leaving Edward deep in thought. He watched Olivia move around the diner, interacting with each patron as if they were old friends. Her laughter echoed, bringing light even to the darkest corners. Days passed, and Dave became a regular customer. Edward found himself looking forward to seeing Olivia every morning, fascinated by her unwavering kindness and silent strength. He began to notice the small things. How she always had a kind word for grumpy customers. How she discreetly slipped extra sandwiches to hungry-looking students. How her smile never wavered, even when Mr. Henderson scolded her for her generosity. One particularly busy morning, Edward noticed Olivia struggling to balance several trays at once. Without thinking, he got up to help her. "Oh, you don't have to," Olivia began, but Edward had already taken one of the trays. "Let me help," he said softly. "It's the least I can do after all your kindness." Together, they distributed the plates, their movements naturally synchronizing. When they finished, Olivia looked at Edward with a new light in her eyes. "Thank you, Dave," she said, lightly touching his arm. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Edward felt his heart race at her touch. "I should be the one thanking you, Olivia, for everything." That afternoon, when the diner was quieter, Olivia joined Edward at his corner table. She seemed tired, but her eyes shone with an inner light that Edward found fascinating. "So, Dave," she began, fiddling with the salt shaker, "what brings you to Maple Street every day? Besides my wonderful coffee, of course," she added with a wink. Edward laughed, feeling lighter than he had in years. "It's a good place to think," he replied honestly. "And the company isn't bad either." Olivia blushed slightly, and Edward felt a wave of affection for her. "And you?" he asked. "Have you always wanted to be a waitress?" Olivia's gaze drifted off for a moment, and she sighed. "Actually, I dream of having my own bakery one day. Something small, cozy, where I can make people happy with my cakes and bread." "That sounds wonderful," Edward said softly. "Why don't you do it?" Olivia let out a humorless laugh. "Money, mostly. Starting a business isn't cheap, and I barely make rent with what I earn here." Edward felt a pang of guilt. Here he was, pretending to be poor, while he had more money than he could ever spend in several lifetimes. He wanted to help her, but knew he couldn't, not as Dave. "You'll make it," he said, covering her hand with his. "Someone with a heart as big as yours deserves to see their dreams come true." Olivia looked at him in surprise, and for a moment, something passed between them, a connection that went beyond words. But before either could speak, the doorbell chimed, announcing new customers. "Duty calls," Olivia said, standing up reluctantly. But before she went, she turned to Edward. "Thank you, Dave, for believing in me." As he watched her walk away, Edward felt something change inside him. He had come to the Maple Street diner looking for authenticity, and found much more than he had expected. In Olivia, he saw a kindness and strength that left him humbled and inspired. That night, lying in his luxurious bed, Edward couldn't get Olivia out of his mind. He knew he was treading on dangerous ground, that the longer he spent with her, the harder it would be to maintain his charade. But for the first time in years, he felt alive, connected to something real and precious. With a sigh, Edward closed his eyes. Olivia's smiling face the last thing on his mind before sleep took him. He knew he was falling in love, and he knew it would complicate everything. But at that moment, all that mattered was the warmth he felt in his chest every time he thought of her, the waitress with a heart of gold who was, unknowingly, changing his life forever. The contrast couldn't have been more glaring. Edward Worthington adjusted his silk tie in front of the full-length mirror in his apartment-sized closet. His fingers brushed against the fine fabric of his Italian suits, each costing more than Olivia's annual salary. Guilt gnawed at him, reminding him of the double life he was leading. "Mr. Worthington?" His assistant, Jack's voice, echoed through the intercom. "The board meeting starts in 30 minutes. Edward sighed, feeling the weight of his responsibilities. "I'll be there in 10 minutes, Jack." "Thank you." Meanwhile, miles away, Olivia woke up in her small apartment to the sound of sirens and the noise of traffic seeping through the thin walls. She stretched, her sore muscles protesting after another long shift at the diner. Her gaze wandered around the cramped room, stopping at the framed photo of her parents. "One day, I'll make you proud," she murmured, touching the image fondly. Back in Edward's world, the Worthington Enterprises boardroom buzzed with whispered conversations and the clatter of gourmet coffee cups. Edward entered, immediately feeling all eyes on him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice firm and confident, so different from the gentle tones he used as Dave. "Let's discuss our new social responsibility initiative." As Edward spoke about aid programs and investments in underserved communities, his mind wandered to Olivia and the Maple Street Diner. Could his two worlds ever meet? That same morning, Olivia faced her own challenges. Mr. Henderson called her into his office, his face a mask of disapproval. "Miller, the numbers don't add up," he grumbled. "You've been giving away too much free food. That needs to stop." Olivia felt her stomach sink. "Mr. Henderson, please. Some of these people have nowhere to go. A little kindness can make all the difference." The manager sighed, rubbing his temples. "Your heart is bigger than our budget, girl. One more complaint, and I'll have to take drastic measures." Leaving the office, Olivia fought back tears. How could she choose between her job and helping those in need? In the afternoon, Edward, disguised as Dave, walked into the Maple Street Diner. His eyes immediately found Olivia, noticing her tired features and strained smile. "Olivia?" he called softly. "Is everything all right?" She turned, her eyes lighting up at the sight of him. "Dave, it's so good to see you." They sat down at a corner table, and Olivia poured her heart out about her conversation with Mr. Henderson. Edward listened intently, his heart aching with every word. "You know," Olivia said, "play with her napkin. Sometimes I wonder what it would be like to have enough money not to worry about these things. To help people without fear of losing my job." Edward swallowed hard, guilt consuming him. He could solve all her problems with a single check, but he knew he couldn't, not as Dave. "You're amazing, Olivia," he said, covering her hand with his. "Don't let anyone dim your kindness." That night, Edward was back in his penthouse, gazing at the city below. Somewhere in that sea of lights was Olivia, probably counting her spare change to pay the bills. His phone rang, Veronica's name flashing on the screen. He hesitated before answering. "Eddie, darling," Veronica's syrupy voice flowed. "I missed you at the charity event last night. Everyone was asking for you." Edward closed his eyes, remembering the world of extravagant parties and fake smiles he had left behind. "Sorry, Veronica. I've been busy." "Too busy for your social life? For me?" she questioned, a hint of irritation in her voice. "What's going on with you, Eddie?" "I just need some time," he replied, his voice weary. After hanging up, Edward found himself comparing Veronica and Olivia. One lived in a world of luxury and superficiality. The other struggled daily, but maintained an unwavering kindness. The next morning, Olivia woke up early to prepare a special batch of muffins. She distributed them among the diner's regular customers, including some homeless who frequented the spot. When Dave arrived, she greeted him with a radiant smile, offering him a warm muffin. "I tried a new recipe," she said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "What do you think?" Edward bit into the muffin, the flavor exploding in his mouth. It was better than any gourmet dessert he'd tasted at five-star restaurants. "It's amazing, Olivia," he said, genuinely impressed. "You have a true talent." Her face lit up with the compliment. "Thank you, Dave." As he watched Olivia move around the diner, smiling and chatting with customers, Edward found himself at a crossroads. His two worlds were colliding, and he knew he would soon have to make a choice. The day wore on, and Edward returned to his billionaire life, attending meetings and making decisions that would affect thousands of lives. But his mind kept drifting back to the small diner and the waitress with the big heart. That night, lying in his luxurious bed, Edward stared at the ceiling, his heart torn between two worlds. On one side, the life he had always known, filled with privileges and responsibilities. On the other, the simplicity and authenticity he found with Olivia. He knew he couldn't keep up this charade forever. Sooner or later, the truth would come out. And when it did, Edward feared losing the one person who made him feel truly alive. With a heavy sigh, he closed his eyes, Olivia's smiling face the last image in his mind before sleep overpowered him. Tomorrow would be another day, another chapter in this complicated story of love and deception. And Edward knew that eventually, he would have to face the consequences of his choices. The next day, Veronica Sinclair gazed at the city through the window of her penthouse apartment, an untouched champagne flute in her hand. Something was wrong with Edward. She could feel it. His frequent absences, vague excuses, and sudden disinterest in the social events that once filled their calendars. "Miss Sinclair?" Her personal assistant's voice interrupted her thoughts. "The private investigator you hired is here." Veronica turned, a calculated smile on her lips. "Send him in, James." A middle-aged man in a discreet suit entered the apartment. "Miss Sinclair, I'm Frank Donovan. I have the information you requested about Mr. Worthington." Excellent, Veronica purred, motioning to a chair. What did you find? Frank opened a folder, revealing several photographs. Mr. Worthington has been regularly visiting a place called Maple Street Diner. He arrives dressed in simple clothes, almost like a beggar. Veronica frowned, picking up one of the photos. In it, Edward, or someone who looked very much like him, sat at a corner table, chatting animatedly with a brunette waitress. Who is she? Veronica asked, her eyes narrowing. Olivia Miller, 28 years old, a waitress for 5 years at the Maple Street Diner, Frank replied promptly. Mr. Worthington spends hours talking to her almost every day. Veronica felt a wave of anger and jealousy wash over her. So that's it? Edward had traded her for a common waitress? Prepare the car, James, she ordered, her voice sharp. I think it's time to pay dear Eddie a surprise visit. The next morning, the sun had barely risen when Veronica's limousine pulled up in front of the Maple Street Diner. Her keen eyes scanned the street, focusing on the establishment's worn facade. You're sure this is the place, Frank? She asked the investigator, who had insisted on accompanying her, his nose wrinkling in distaste. Yes, ma'am, Frank responded, consulting his notes. Mr. Worthington should arrive any moment if he follows his usual pattern. Veronica adjusted her sunglasses, a malicious smile forming on her perfectly painted lips. Well, let's see what our dear Eddie is up to. Inside the diner, Olivia was in the middle of her morning shift, completely unaware of the looming presence outside. She brightened when she saw Dave enter, her heart racing as it always did when he appeared. Good morning, stranger, she teased, already preparing his coffee. The usual? Edward nodded, his smile genuine but with a hint of worry in his eyes. Olivia, he began hesitantly, I need to tell you something. Before he could continue, the doorbell jingled, announcing Veronica's entrance. Silence descended over the diner as all eyes turned to the newcomer, her elegant presence in stark contrast to the modest surroundings. Olivia approached, her professional smile in place. Good morning, ma'am. How may I help you? Veronica removed her sunglasses, her cold eyes assessing Olivia from head to toe. I'm looking for Edward Worthington. Have you seen him around? Olivia's heart skipped a beat, confusion evident on her face. I'm sorry, I don't know anyone by that name. Edward, still seated at his usual table, felt his blood run cold. He watched the scene unfold, torn between the urge to reveal himself and fear of the consequences. Veronica laughed, a cold, humorless sound. Of course you don't, darling. He's probably using another name. Perhaps. Dave? Olivia's eyes widened, instinctively turning to Edward. In that moment, everything seemed to click into place. The ragged clothes that never really looked worn, the uncalloused hands of someone who had never worked laboriously, the knowledge that sometimes slipped during their conversations. Dave? She whispered, betrayal evident in her voice. Edward rose slowly, his disguise crumbling before her eyes. Olivia, I can explain. But Veronica gave him no chance. She stepped forward, her voice sharp as a blade. Eddie, dear, what games have you been playing? Pretending to be a beggar? Is this some sort of bizarre social experiment? The entire diner watched in shocked silence as the truth came out. Olivia felt the world spin around her, her hands shaking as she held the coffee pot. You lied to me? All this time? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward took a step toward her, his eyes pleading for understanding. Olivia, please, it's not what you think. But his words were cut off by the sound of the coffee pot shattering on the floor. Olivia had dropped it, tears now streaming freely down her face. Leave, she said, her voice trembling with contained emotion. Both of you. Leave now. Veronica smiled triumphantly, linking her arm with Edward's. Come on, Eddie. We've had enough fun slumming it. Edward resisted, his eyes never leaving Olivia's face. Please, let me explain. It's not what it seems. But Olivia had already turned away, disappearing into the kitchen. Mr. Henderson emerged, his face red with anger. You heard the lady. Out of here before I call the police. Reluctantly, Edward allowed Veronica to lead him out of the diner. As they entered the limousine, He looked back one last time, his heart breaking as he saw Olivia through the kitchen window, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "Oh, Eddie," Veronica sighed, patting his arm. "What a strange phase you're going through. But don't worry, I'll help you get over it." Edward barely heard her words, his mind a storm of guilt and regret. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, and now he was at risk of losing the only person who made him feel truly alive. In the diner, Olivia leaned against the kitchen sink, trying to process what had happened. All the conversations, shared moments, revealed dreams. Everything felt like a lie now. "Miss Miller?" Mr. Henderson's hesitant voice brought her back to reality. "Are you all right?" Olivia wiped away the tears, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, Mr. Henderson. I'll clean up that mess and get back to work." As she moved mechanically, cleaning the broken glass and spilled coffee, Olivia felt something harden inside her. The trust she had so freely given was shaken, and she wondered if she'd ever be able to trust again. Outside, Edward's limousine disappeared into the city's traffic, taking with it the fragments of a dream that had barely begun to take shape. The distance between their worlds, once an invisible barrier, now seemed like an insurmountable chasm. And so, with broken hearts and revealed truths, both Edward and Olivia found themselves at a crossroads, facing the consequences of secrets kept too long and the harsh reality of a love born out of a lie. The days following the confrontation at the Maple Street diner were a blur of conflicting emotions for Edward. He oscillated between overwhelming guilt and a desperate desire to explain everything to Olivia. Several times, he found himself driving to the diner, only to turn around at the last moment, paralyzed by the fear of rejection. Meanwhile, Olivia struggled with her own emotional storm. The betrayal by Dave, or Edward, as she now knew, had shaken her confidence to its core. She found herself glancing at the door every time the bell jingled, half expecting, half dreading to see his familiar face. One particularly hectic morning, Olivia was so distracted that she almost dropped a tray full of dishes. Mr. Henderson, who had been watching her erratic behavior over the past few days, called her into his office. "Miller," he began, his tone softer than usual. "What's going on with you? Since that incident with the millionaire, you haven't been the same." Olivia sighed, feeling the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I'm sorry, Mr. Henderson. I just need some time to process everything." The manager studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Look, I'm not good with these emotional things, but maybe you should take a few days off. Clear your head." Surprised by the unexpected show of compassion, Olivia felt tears well up in her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Henderson. I really appreciate it." Meanwhile, in Edward's office at Worthington Enterprises, the atmosphere was equally tense. He could barely concentrate on meetings, his mind constantly drifting back to Olivia and the mess he had created. "Mr. Worthington?" His secretary's voice brought him back to reality. "Miss Sinclair is here to see you." Edward groaned internally. Veronica was the last person he wanted to see at that moment. But before he could come up with an excuse, she was already striding into his office, a predatory smile on her lips. "Eddie, darling," she purred, sliding into a chair across from his desk. "I thought we should talk about your little hobby." Edward straightened, his face a mask of forced calm. "Veronica, what happened at the diner?" Was fascinating. She interrupted, her eyes glinting dangerously. "You know, Eddie, I always knew you were eccentric, but pretending to be a beggar? That's a new level, even for you." "It wasn't a joke, Veronica," Edward said, his voice firm. "I was looking for something real, something authentic." Veronica laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "And you found that in a waitress?" "Oh, Eddie, don't be naive. She was probably just interested in your money, like all the others." Veronica's words hit Edward like a punch to the gut. He knew it wasn't true, that Olivia was different, but the seed of doubt was already planted. "You don't know her," he said, more to himself than to Veronica. "And do you?" Veronica countered, leaning forward. "Come on, Eddie. Come back to the real world. We have a gala next week, and everyone is expecting to see the great Edward Worthington." Edward hesitated, feeling cornered. Part of him wanted to refuse, to run back to the simplicity and authenticity he had found with Olivia. But another part, the part that had been raised in this world of wealth and expectations, pulled him back. "I'll think about it," he finally replied, his voice weary. Satisfied that she had planted the seed of doubt, Veronica rose gracefully. "Do that, darling. And remember, you belong in this world, not hers." After she left, Edward sank into his chair, feeling the weight of his choices crushing him. He picked up his phone, his fingers hovering over the diner's number. He wanted to hear Olivia's voice, to explain everything, to beg for forgiveness. But what could he say that wouldn't sound like another lie? That night, Edward found himself driving aimlessly through the city, eventually stopping in front of the Maple Street diner. The lights were off, the place closed for the night. Through the window, he could see the empty tables, almost like ghosts of all the conversations and moments he had shared with Olivia. With a heavy heart, Edward realized he was at a crossroads. On one side, the world he had always known, full of expectations and responsibilities. On the other, the promise of something real and authentic, but built on a foundation of lies. As he looked at the silent diner, Edward made a decision. He couldn't continue living this lie. It was time to face the truth, no matter the consequences. Tomorrow, he would return to the Maple Street diner, not as Dave, but as Edward Worthington. And he would tell Olivia the whole truth, hoping against hope that it wasn't too late to fix what he'd broken. With this resolution in mind, Edward started the car and drove away, leaving the diner behind and taking with him the promise of a new beginning. What he didn't know was that destiny had other plans, and the next day would bring revelations that would change everything once again. The morning arrived with a gentle drizzle, as if the sky itself was mourning the lies and broken hearts. Edward adjusted his tie, staring at his reflection. Today he wasn't the imposing billionaire or the disguised beggar. He was simply a man, vulnerable and full of regrets, about to face the consequences of his actions. With a heavy heart, he drove to the Maple Street diner. Every mile traveled seemed to increase the weight on his chest. Upon arrival, he hesitated for a moment before stepping out of the car, the soft rain dampening his expensive suit. Inside the diner, Olivia was busy wiping down the counter, her mechanical movements betraying her distraction. The past few days had been a whirlwind of emotions, and she was still struggling to process everything that had happened. The doorbell jingled, and Olivia looked up automatically. Her heart stopped for a moment when she saw Edward, the real Edward, standing in the entrance, looking as out of place as a fish out of water. "Olivia," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the murmur of other customers. She felt a wave of conflicting emotions, anger, hurt, confusion, and, to her surprise, a hint of relief at seeing him again. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Edward stepped forward, ignoring the curious glances from other patrons. "I need to talk to you. Please, just give me a few minutes." Before Olivia could respond, Mr. Henderson emerged from the kitchen, his eyes narrowing as he recognized Edward. I said to stay away from here." Edward raised his hands in a peaceful gesture. "Please, sir, I just want to talk. After that, if Olivia wants me to leave, I will, and I'll never come back." Olivia looked between Edward and her boss, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. Finally, she sighed. "It's okay, Mr. Henderson. I can handle this." Reluctantly, Mr. Henderson nodded, casting a final warning glance at Edward before retreating to the kitchen. Olivia led Edward to a corner table, away from prying ears. For a moment, they sat in silence, the chasm between their worlds feeling larger than ever. "I'm so sorry," Edward finally said, his voice laden with regret. "I never meant to hurt you, Olivia. It all started as a search for something authentic, something real in a world that always felt so fake to me. But then I met you, and everything changed." Olivia studied him, searching for signs of the person she thought she knew in Dave. "Why continue the lie? Why not tell me the truth?" Edward lowered his eyes, shame evident on his face. "At first it was fear that if you knew who I really was, everything would change. And then it was fear of losing you. I knew I'd made a mistake, but I didn't know how to fix it without destroying everything we'd built. Olivia felt tears welling in her eyes, but held them back. You didn't trust me enough to give me the chance to understand. I know, Edward said, his voice cracking, and that's my greatest regret. Olivia, you showed me a world I didn't even know existed. A world of genuine kindness, of real connections. You made me want to be a better person. Olivia looked at him, conflict evident in her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe him, to forgive and start anew. But another part, the part that had been betrayed and hurt, kept her cautious. How can I trust you now? She asked quietly. How can I know this isn't just another performance? Edward reached across the table, almost touching her hand, but stopping himself at the last moment. I can't undo what I did, but I can promise to be completely honest from now on. No more lies, no more secrets. Just me, Edward Worthington, an imperfect man who made a terrible mistake but is desperate to fix it. The silence that followed was heavy, laden with possibilities and unspoken fears. Olivia looked at her hands, then back at Edward, seeing for the first time the vulnerability and genuine regret in his eyes. I don't know if I can forgive you, she finally said, her voice low but firm. At least not now. But maybe we can start over. Slowly. Like two people who just met, without lies or expectations. A glimmer of hope lit up Edward's face. I would like that very much, he said softly. At that moment, the doorbell chimed again, and both turned to see who entered. To Edward's surprise and horror, it was Veronica, her eyes gleaming with a mix of triumph and malice. Eddie, darling, she purred, approaching the table. So this is where you've been hiding. And with your little working-class friend. Edward stood up abruptly, placing himself between Veronica and Olivia. Veronica, what are you doing here? She smiled, a cold, calculated smile. Just checking if you've finally come to your senses. After all, we have that gala dinner tonight, remember? Olivia watched the scene unfold, feeling as if she were watching a movie about someone else's life. The reality of Edward's world, so different from her own, hit her with full force. Edward looked between Veronica and Olivia, feeling the weight of his choices more than ever. This was the moment of truth, the moment to decide who he really wanted to be and what life he wanted to lead. With a deep breath, he turned to Veronica, his decision made. There won't be a gala dinner, Veronica. Not for me. My place is here. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Olivia looked at Edward, surprised and a little scared by the intensity of his declaration. Veronica, on the other hand, looked furious. You're throwing everything away because of her? Veronica hissed, pointing at Olivia. She's not even from our world, Edward. Edward smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his eyes. Maybe it's time I changed worlds, then. As Veronica stormed out of the diner, Edward turned back to Olivia. Uncertainty and hope mingled in his gaze. I meant every word, he said softly. If you'll give me a chance, I'd like to get to know your world. The real world. Olivia studied him for a long moment, her heart conflicted. Finally, she reached out, lightly touching his hand. One step at a time, Edward. One step at a time. The weeks following the confrontation at the Maple Street Diner were a period of adjustment and rediscovery for Edward and Olivia. True to his word, Edward began showing up regularly at the diner, no longer as the beggar Dave, but as himself, a man trying to find his place in a world that once felt unfamiliar to him. On a quiet afternoon, Edward sat at his usual table, watching Olivia work. She moved gracefully between the tables, her gentle smile lighting up each customer's face. It was then that an idea began to form in his mind. Olivia, he called softly as she passed by his table. Can I talk to you for a moment? She hesitated briefly before sitting across from him. Although they had agreed to start over, a palpable tension still lingered between them. What is it, Edward? She asked, her voice neutral. Edward took a deep breath, gathering his courage. I've been thinking about your dream of opening a bakery, and I want to help. Olivia's eyes widened in surprise. Edward, please let me finish, he gently interrupted. I know you probably don't want anything from me, especially money. But this isn't charity, Olivia. It's an investment. In you, in your talent. Olivia studied him for a long moment, conflict evident in her eyes. I don't know, Edward. It seems complicated. It doesn't have to be, he assured her. I could be a silent investor. No one needs to know the money came from me. It will be your business, your bakery. I just want to give you the chance to fulfill your dream. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken possibilities. Finally, Olivia spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. Why would you do this? Edward smiled softly. Because I believe in you, Olivia. And because, well, let's just say I have a lot to make up for. In the days that followed, the idea of the bakery began to take shape. Initially hesitant, Olivia gradually warmed to the possibility. She and Edward spent hours discussing plans, checking out potential locations, and dreaming about the future. One evening, as they walked together after another planning session, Olivia stopped abruptly. Edward, she said, turning to face him, I need to know, is all of this real? Or is it just your way of making amends? Edward felt his heart clench at the vulnerability in her voice. He took her hands in his eyes meeting hers. Olivia, this is more real than anything I've ever experienced. Yes, I want to make amends. But more than that, I want to be part of something genuine, something meaningful. And what we're building together, is exactly that. Tears glistened in Olivia's eyes, but she smiled, a true smile that lit up her entire face. Okay, she whispered. Let's do this. The following months were a whirlwind of activity. Edward used his connections to expedite processes that would ordinarily take years. Olivia dove headfirst into planning, testing recipes, and refining her menu. Together, they transformed an empty space into a welcoming bakery, each detail carefully chosen to reflect Olivia's dream. As the grand opening approached, excitement was palpable. Olivia stayed up late nights, perfecting her creations. Edward, meanwhile, found himself increasingly immersed in Olivia's world, learning about flour and yeast, about the rhythm of a busy kitchen. On the eve of the opening, Edward found Olivia in a new bakery's kitchen, covered in flour and with a look of pure contentment on her face. It's really happening, isn't it? She said, looking around in awe. Edward smiled, feeling a wave of affection for her. Yes, it is. And you deserve every bit of it, Olivia. She turned to him, her eyes shining with emotion. Thank you, Edward, for believing in me, for everything. In that moment, standing in the bakery kitchen they had built together, Edward and Olivia felt something shift between them. The last vestige of mistrust dissolved, replaced by mutual understanding and deep affection. Edward stepped forward, his heart racing. Olivia, but before he could finish, the oven timer beeped, breaking the moment. Olivia laughed, a light, joyful sound that made Edward's heart leap. The show must go on, she said with a smile, turning back to the oven. Edward watched her work, marveling at her passion and dedication. He knew that, no matter what happened the next day at the opening, they had already achieved something precious. Together, they had turned lies into truth, distrust into partnership, and dreams into reality. As the aroma of fresh bread filled the air, Edward knew for certain. This was not just the realization of Olivia's dream. It was the beginning of something new for both of them, something truly precious. The grand opening of the Maple Street Bakery arrived with a blend of nerves and excitement. The launch was a resounding success. As Olivia charmed the customers with her smiles and stories, Edward watched from behind the scenes, his heart brimming with pride and affection. At the end of the day, when the last customer left, a comfortable silence enveloped the bakery. Olivia turned to Edward, tears of joy in her eyes. We did it, she whispered. Edward stepped forward, his heart racing. Olivia, I need to tell you something. She looked at him expectantly. When I started this journey, I was searching for something authentic, Edward began. I never imagined that I would find not only that, but also love. Olivia's eyes widened. I love you, Olivia, he said simply, with all my heart. For a moment, Olivia was silent. Then, a radiant smile spread across her face. I love you too, Edward, she replied softly. The man you truly are. Edward closed the distance between them, cupping Olivia's face in his hands. Their lips met in a sweet kiss, full of promises. When they parted, both were smiling, their foreheads touching. What happens now? Olivia asked. Edward entwined his fingers with hers. Now, my love, we write our own story. Together. And there, in the bakery they had built with love and trust, Edward and Olivia began the next chapter of their lives. A chapter where the masks had fallen, the lies had been forgiven, and love had triumphed over all obstacles. If you enjoyed the story, don't miss the next ones appearing on your screen. Thank you for watching.